So, as Ed just said, women on average are having just one child. The official birth rate is 1.58 births per woman. This is a serious flow-on effect for the economy. It means our population is ageing. It means we rely more on immigration. And it means that economic growth could be hampered. Women are becoming more educated, more involved in the labour force and more successful, which brings me to my next guest. Joining me live is the Executive Director at the Parenthood, Georgie Dent. Good to see you in person. I love it.
Good morning.
This was such an interesting piece today. Peter Costello famously said, one for mum, one for dad, one for the country. And that is just simply not happening. I wanted to talk to you because there is a few things that could encourage families to have more children. One of those is childcare, Georgie.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that isn't really well understood is the extent to which Australia does not actually give young families the support they need. And I think the declining birth rate reflects that. So Australia has got one of the least adequate paid parental leave schemes in the developed world. And then we've got some of the most expensive out-of-pocket costs for early education and care. Now, both of those factors make it really difficult for parents to be able to provide for their family and care for their family. So, the cost of living right around Australia is significant. We know there's been stagnant wage growth. We know that the cost of living pressure on families is really significant. So these issues, and particularly the cost of early education and care, acts as a real deterrent from families having more children because it is really difficult. And I think Australia, there are lots of people that assume, because we call ourselves a lucky country, that we are a country that provide really fantastic opportunities for children and young families, but we don't.
Well, the care is wonderful from personal experience, but the cost is incredible. And this all started out of a conversation we were having yesterday about families simply going into debt to pay for childcare. That is not uncommon.
Absolutely not. And as you said yesterday, there were a few people on social media talking about the fact that if you've got two children, for example, and they're in care even 3 days a week, the amount that you are paying is astronomical. And a lot of families, the only way through that is to go into debt. Now, that's not an option for lots of families, but even for the families who can do that, that means it's money that can't be spent on providing for the children and doing other things.
It's not productive for the economy.
And the other thing is, on the economic front, Australia has got a very curious gap. So we are the #1 country in the world for educating women and girls. We are 70th in the world for female workforce participation. And that is a direct result of us having some of the most expensive early education and care in the world. So we know that women in Australia are limiting their work because the cost of care is so high, and it doesn't have to be like this. And the sort of fantastic opportunity with early education and care is that we don't just boost productivity by enabling and supporting women to participate in paid work, but we actually create better outcomes for children. So we know that the best thing that we can do for children between 0 and 5 to set them up for lifelong success, for optimal health, social, educational and economic outcomes, is by having them being able to access high quality early learning and care.
Yeah. We've been trying to explain this for a while, right? I think the time for politeness is running out a little bit. But look, it's very expensive. All governments need to make decisions about priorities. What about a radical idea that childcare is free for at least a couple of days for everyone, unless you can pay? Unless you can afford to pay and your household makes that decision, would that work?
Well, I think we have to look at this the way we look at primary school, for example. And if we were in a system where all primary education was privately funded by parents, it would be astronomical. Now, no one says it's a radical concept that if your parents are unemployed or your parents are millionaires, there's a spot for every single 5 or 6-year-old at a public school. We are comfortable with that because we recognise education is a public service. We have to start looking at early education and care the same way. Now, the Centre for Policy Development 2 weeks ago put out a fantastic report, and it's the Starting Better Guarantee for Young Families. And it proposes exactly what you just said, 3 days a week that is free or almost free for all families, so that every child between 0 and 5 can access the early education and care they need. And then beyond that, families would pay. Now, yes, this is expensive, there's no way around that. But Australia is already spending in excess of $10 billion a year on our childcare subsidy. We've been doing that. It grows exponentially every year.
Yeah.
The investment from the government is significant, but it's inefficient because despite increasing the subsidy, we haven't seen prices go down meaningfully. We haven't seen educators being paid better. We haven't seen across the board a lift in quality that would reflect that increased investment. And to me, that reflects the subsidy is an inefficient way of funding early education and care.
And many people might not know this, but it's not all centres, but some centres do are hugely profitable businesses, but you also have to pay, even if your child doesn't go and they're closed on a public holiday, you still have to pay for that day. You still have to pay if you go on holidays as a family and are not there, and you must pay for sick days. And your child is very sick all the time because that's how children are. They're a bit grubby. Does there need to be better regulation around that? I can't imagine any other industry getting away with charging those kinds of fees on the days where kids aren't there.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I bring it back to the primary school example. You know, no one has to pay for the school holidays because we accept that public education is important, and we're in this sort of zone. I think we have been stuck in a zone for a while where people are sort of thinking that early education and care is some form of welfare, instead of looking at it as sort of critical social infrastructure. And I think that, you know, we've even had in New South Wales, the Treasurer yesterday at the National Press Club has really acknowledged that this is an area where we need to think about it differently. And I welcome that sort of leadership and big picture thinking because we can do better. And the other thing is, when we spend this money properly, we get the return. There are very few policy areas. For every dollar we spend on early education in the year before school, we get a $2 return. For children with any disadvantage, that return is upwards of $7 for every dollar we spend. Now, that is a good investment, and we need to look at this as an investment that will reap benefits in the short and the long term for families, for women and for children.